The question is, how is the Formula One grid performing under the new 2026 regulations? With that question in mind, I want to share a study and some interesting discoveries I found. What I did was collect data from the official Formula One website, normalize the information, and then apply 7 performance indexes. The focus of this analysis is the Miami Grand Prix 2026 race qualifying session because this is where drivers push the cars to the limit. Then, this data is compared against Miami Grand Prix 2025 race qualifying session, as well as the Miami Grand Prix 2026 sprint qualifying session. As we move forward, if you have any questions, observations, or comments, don't be shy. Your feedback may help shape future editions of this report. Now, let's make a quick review of the 7 indexes. Max time, the slowest lap time recorded in the session. Minimum time or mean time, the fastest lap time recorded in the session. Average time, the average lap time across all drivers who completed a representative fast lap. Density index, how close the grid was to P1. Field spread, the percentage difference between the fastest and the slowest lap times. Standard deviation shows how similar or spread out the lap times were across the grid. Lower values indicate more consistency. Deficit, the time gaps across the grid compared to P1. At this moment, these terms and numbers may not mean much yet, but as we go deeper into the analysis, they will help us to build a clear picture of the overall performance of the grid. Now, this is where Formula One starts to feel unreal. Antonelli was only 0.285 milliseconds faster than Leclerc in Miami qualifying 1. At first, the gap may sound small, but when we translated that number into real distance at the average speed of the Miami circuit at 230 kilometers per hour, the difference becomes more than 18 meters. That's nearly 20 yards, more than 3 Formula One cars' length. With this in mind, we began answering the question of how far the Formula One 2026 regulations are from 2025. When comparing P1 of Q1 from 2026 versus 2025, we have a lap time difference of 1.783 milliseconds, meaning 2026 is 6.6% slower. And when comparing P2 versus P1 gap from 2026 to 2025, we see a difference of 0.2237 milliseconds slower in 2026 relative to 2025. When comparing the field spread from P1 to the slowest value between 2026 and 2025, we find a difference of 4.4%. This indicates that overall, the cars are slower compared to 2025, and the grid is also more spread out and slower relative to P1 in 2026 than in 2025. Let's remember that this analysis uses 6 indexes to evaluate the grid, plus one additional index focused on driver performance. Now, in Q2, only the 16 fastest drivers remain, and they must improve their lap times to move into the next phase, as the 6 slowest times will be eliminated. Let's review the Q2 indexes. The fastest lap was a 1 minute 28 seconds, 160 milliseconds, while the slowest time was a 1 minute 29 seconds, 946 milliseconds. We have an average time of 1 minute 28 seconds, 984 milliseconds, a density index of 99.0148%, and a field spread of 2.0768%, and a standard deviation of 0.6768%. A little later, we will compare these indices from each qualifying session to better understand how they evolve throughout the classification stages. Now, let's take a closer look at what happened between the drivers within the top four. Between Verstappen and Antonelli, the gap was 0.173 milliseconds, equivalent to 0.1963%. P1 versus P4. Between Verstappen and Piastri, the difference was 0.216 milliseconds or 0.2551%. Then, between P3 and P4, the closest deficit came between Leclerc and Piastri, with only 0.017 milliseconds, separating them just by 0.013%. With these indexes, we can already begin building a clear picture of just how close the battle between drivers and the entire grid could become. Now, let's take a closer look at the situation when comparing Q2 in 2026 versus 2025. When comparing the P1 laps times between 2026 and 2025, we find that the 2026 cars were slower by 1 second 847 milliseconds, a difference of 7.03%. Looking at the P2 to P1 deficit, the gap was actually smaller in 2026 with 0.1963% compared to 0.2666% in 2025. However, despite the closer fight at the front in 2026, the overall pace in 2025 was still significantly faster, with P2 setting a 1 minute 26 seconds and 499 millisecond lap in 2025 versus 1 minute 28 seconds and 289 milliseconds in 2026. In other words, while the battle at the top was tighter in 2026, the outright speed was much higher in 2025, with a 1 second 790 milliseconds advantage when comparing only the P2 lap times. But when comparing P15 against P1 in both seasons, the deficit was lower in 2026 by 0.8087%, indicating that the slowest cars in 2026 field are falling even further behind relative to the leaders. Now we move into the most intense part of qualifying, Q3. With only 10 drivers left on track, the battle for the top 10 positions on the starting grid is finally decided. With more space on track and cleaner air conditions, lap times tend to improve significantly. A fastest lap of 1 minute 27 seconds and 798 milliseconds, combined with a density index of 99.4313%, points to a highly compact group, with a field spread of only 1.1526%. Now, let's take a look at what happened from the perspective of drivers' deficits. We can see that between P1 and P2, the difference was just 166 milliseconds, a deficit of 0.1891%, which, as we saw back in Q1, would translate roughly in 10.6 meters between P1 and P2. It slightly breaks the viewer's sense of reality, because if both cars pass at the same point and we blink it, we probably wouldn't even notice the difference between them. Continuing further, when comparing P1 and P4, the difference grows to 0.385 milliseconds, with a deficit of 0.4385%. And when comparing P1 to P9, the gap increases to 1 second and 12 milliseconds, representing a deficit of 1.1526%. Let's compare what happened in Q3 between 2026 and 2025. We find that the 2026 P1 lap was slower by 1 second, 594 milliseconds, compared to the 2025 P1 time. Looking at the P2 to P1 deficit, the gap in 2026 was larger than in 2025 by 0.101 milliseconds. Comparing the slowest Q3 car in 2026, P9, the deficit was 1.12 milliseconds, that will be 1.1526%, while in 2025, P10 recorded a deficit of 0.739 milliseconds, that will be 0.8573%, meaning the 2026 field was 273 milliseconds slower at the back of the top 10. In terms of overall spread, 2026 recorded 1.1526% compared to 0.8573% in 2025. In other words, the 2026 Q3 field was 0.2953% more spread out than the 2025 grid. Let's remember that we are specifically analyzing race qualifying sessions from the Miami Grand Prix in both 2026 and 2025. From these comparisons, we can determine that the 2026 generation is slower than 2025 so far, while also showing a less compact and more dispersed grid overall. It's also important to mention that, just like in 2025, the performance metrics in 2026 improve progressively as cars are eliminated throughout qualifying. Q3 becomes faster, tighter, and more competitive than both Q2 and Q1. Don't worry if you weren't able to absorb all the information shown in this video. What you are seeing here is only an extract from a much more complete analysis. In the description, you will find two links, one for the infographic summary featuring this video, and another for the full analysis including all tables and data. The directed link allows you to open or download the file instantly without needing to share any personal information. The best qualifying session we have been using throughout this analysis was the race qualifying session from the Miami Grand Prix 2026, which we previously compared against the equivalent race qualifying session from the Miami Grand Prix 2025. Now we are going to compare the Miami Grand Prix 2026 race qualifying session against the sprint qualifying session from the same Miami Grand Prix weekend in 2026. When comparing the best lap times from Q1, Q2, and Q3, the race qualifying sessions were faster than the sprint qualifying sessions. On the average pace side, the group was also faster during the race qualifying compared to the sprint qualifying, with a special emphasis in Q2, where race qualifying was a little bit more than a half of a second faster than a sprint qualifying. Regarding the density index, the field was more compact during race qualifying than during sprint qualifying across all three sessions. This demonstrates the setup improvements and driving evolution achieved by all teams throughout the weekend. Kimi Antonelli extended his opening stint and finished in P1, proving that Mercedes understood the new Formula 1 2026 regulations extremely well. Liam Lawson needs to be more careful after damaging Pierre Gasly's chances of scoring points. Gasly had stretched his stint from P9, but dropped it to P21 with a DNF. Gabriel Bortoleto, starting from P21, after extending his stint, managed to recover all the way up to P12, gaining 9 positions. Max Verstappen, despite extending in P2 and finishing in P5, had to fight back after a 360 spin into lap 1. Resilience and development. The gaps seen in qualifying continue to grow once race pace comes into play. Both resilience and car development remain a major challenge for some teams like Audi, Aston Martin, and Cadillac. The International Automobile Federation and Formula One management have continued making safety adjustments to avoid sudden speed changes caused by power unit rechargers phases. Fastest lap. This data is only obtained from the race sessions of each Grand Prix. For the Miami Grand Prix 2026, the gap between the fastest and the slowest lap reached 9.294 kilometers per hour, with a speed deficit of 4.5837%, while in 2025 the speed deficit was 3.1655%. Now, when comparing the fastest lap between 2026 versus 2025, the results shows a difference of 5 kilometers slower in 2026, with a deficit of 2.3110%. This means that Formula One 2026 regulations are already getting closer to matching the pace of the previous generations of cars. In a future edition, we will continue tracking how the gap between 2026 and 2025 regulation evolves across Australia, China, Japan, Miami, and Canada Grand Prix. Championship standings. After 4 rounds, Kimi Antonelli leads the Drivers' Championship with 100 points, followed by George Russell. In second place with 80 points. In third place with 59 points is Charles Leclerc, while Lando Norris sits in third place, tied on points with Lewis Hamilton at 51 points each. So far, the only drivers still on 0 points are Nico Hülkenberg, Valtteri Bottas, Fernando Alonso, Lance Stroll, and Sergio Perez. With the rapid development teams are achieving under the new Formula One 2026 regulations, from my point of view, before the end of this season, we could see a grid where every driver is scoring points. Constructors' Championship. With what appears to be a near perfect understanding of the regulations and, at times, creating controversy, Mercedes leads the Constructors' Championship with 180 points, followed by Ferrari with 110 points. So far, only Aston Martin and Cadillac have yet scored points.
Before you go, it will really help improve future editions if you could leave a comment. And if this report shares something you haven't seen before, or if you enjoyed the format, please leave a like. And if you know someone who loves Formula One, share this report with them. Thank you.
And don't forget, you can download both the infographic version used in this video and the original report, which contains much more detailed information.